Hi, I'm Melissa Gant. We're going to give you some information to help you get the most out of your test. We'll talk about how to understand the results, how to find substitutes for the foods you're sensitive to, as well as useful tips for dramatically improving your general health and well-being. Let me introduce you to the co-developer of the ALCAT test and co-author of Your Hidden Food Allergies Are Making You Fat, Roger Deutsch, as well as Dr. David Brady, Director of the Human Nutrition Institute at the University of Bridgeport. Let's get started. So how does this test work?
Well, the test is actually fairly simple and straightforward. We collect the blood, and it gets sent by a courier to the lab. So when it arrives in our lab, it's important that all the blood cells and the proteins that are in the blood are actually still alive, because what we're doing is a biological challenge to the blood, and here's how it works. We take the blood and we divide it into a number of subsamples, and it's diluted with a buffer, and then they each go into a well. Now the well actually will have the test substance inside of it. So if we're testing, say, for 150 foods, there will be 150 wells, each one having a different food extract inside. Or if we're testing for food additives also, we actually put the food extract into the well. So the blood is actually interacting with the substance. And then we incubate it. It's in a cassette. And we incubate it at body temperature for a period of time. So what we're doing is we're allowing a reaction to take place which will mimic the conditions that actually happen when the food is eaten and absorbed and into your bloodstream. So at this stage, we put it through an analyzer. And the analyzer will tell us whether or not the white blood cells, the immune system cells, are showing any reaction to the presence of the food or the substance or the chemical, indicated by a change in the white blood cell size and or number, or a few other minor things that may happen occasionally. And if we see a change that's significant, it correlates with what happens when you actually eat the food. And of course, if the food is safe for you and doesn't cause a reaction, we don't really see any change going on.
Okay, so you get your test results back. How do you understand the test report?
The test report is fairly simple. It's color-coded, as you can see. We have the green foods, and these are all the foods that do not show a reaction. So they're not showing a reaction in the well or the test tube. So for the most part, we can assume that those foods are safe when you eat them. Then we have foods that do show a reaction. Now, the reaction could be small, it could be fairly large, or it could be very large. So the small reactions, which we call borderline, are placed into the yellow category. And you'll see on the number of foods in the yellow category. These may be causing some problems, they may not. And I'll come back to what we do with those in just a moment. Then we have orange foods and red foods. Now, orange is a greater degree of concern, and red is a much greater degree of alarm. That means that the blood cells had a larger reaction. The orange and the red foods ought to be eliminated from the diet. Not only the food themselves, but if that food is contained within something else, we have to be mindful of that and avoid it.
So for example, if, let's say, it comes back with an allergy to milk, but milk is in, let's say, a certain type of bread, do you have to avoid that bread?
You do. So milk, for example, well, by the way, we use the word intolerance and I'll explain the difference later on between allergy and intolerance. And the ALCAT test is measuring intolerances. But yes, if milk is in bread, which it often is, or in crackers, and certainly milk is in cheese and yogurt and so on and so forth, we would have to avoid the foods as well.
Dr. Brady, what can someone do if they have a lot of reactions? The results come back and there are a lot of foods that show to be sensitive to.
Right, and that is actually fairly common. It's more common than you would think because in our modern foods of convenience type of diet, there's a lot of hidden foods. As Roger had just talked about, if you're allergic to milk, let's say you have to avoid the foods that milk is in. Well, in a lot of the convenient foods that we eat, that the food industry has processed, there is milk in them, there's wheat in them, there's corn in them, there's often soy in them. So we're getting overexposed to a lot of common proteins in the diet, where if we were really eating a fresh whole food diet and really varying the type of foods we ate more, we wouldn't be overexposed to these proteins, and our immune response would be very different to the foods that we eat. So someone who has a lot of responses, we call that panallergy. That's often not a disorder in and of itself. It's often a result of some things. It's a result, like I mentioned just before, of eating the same foods all the time. And if you do diet diaries on Americans, they usually eat about 12 different foods. And they just eat them all, every day, day in, day out. The other thing is if they're not digesting those food proteins adequately. A lot of Americans have problems with their digestion. A lot of Americans take antacid medications. As people get older, their stomach acid declines generally, even though when they become symptomatic, they're often put on antacid medications, which is not always the best thing to do. But whether it's because of medications or not, if you're not digesting the proteins very well, you don't prepare them right for the body's immune system to accept them. And they're looked at by the body as a foreign invading protein, just almost like it would look at a bacteria or a virus, for instance. So if we're not digesting the foods well because we don't make enough enzymes or because we don't have adequate stomach acid, then we may become allergic to a lot of the foods we eat. Also, a lot of things in the modern lifestyle, including stress and other things, really decline the ability of our intestinal lining to keep out what's bad and only let in what's good. We get a condition known as leaky gut. Basically, things are allowed to come through the intestines and enter the bloodstream and the lymphatic stream before they're adequately prepared. And this includes proteins and foods which can cause intolerances or even in some cases overt allergy. So by rotating the diet, eliminating certain foods for a while, improving digestion and improving overall gastrointestinal health, we can help the patient start to be able to eat certain foods again.
Interesting. Now, Roger, I know in your book you talk about how food intolerances can create cravings.
How do food intolerances create cravings? That's a really interesting question. I can tell you for sure they do. Because just about everybody who has a problem with cravings loses it when they figure out what foods they're intolerant of and take them out of the diet. Here's what we think is happening. We found out now that serotonin, which is a very important chemical, which most people know as being a neurotransmitter, meaning a chemical that communicates messages in the brain, is responsible for making a person feel happy, comfortable, relaxed, and also controls their hunger. So now what we found out recently is that when there's an inflammatory process going on in the gut, this is very interesting, 65% of the immune system is in the gut. And when there's an inflammatory process going on and some of the immune cells are talking to the other immune cells, one of the chemicals they use for their communication, and therefore it gets absorbed, is serotonin. So guess what? It looks like we're creating a serotonin deficit in other parts of the body, particularly the brain. So a person begins to feel a little uneasy, uncomfortable, and they unconsciously know that they can correct their feeling by changing the level of serotonin in the brain. And here's how you do it. You eat sugar, or you eat a high glycemic index food. Now, why does that help? A high glycemic index food means that it breaks down into sugar very quickly. We're talking about refined flours and things like this. They break down into sugar in the blood quickly. This elicits a response of insulin. So you get a rapid response of insulin. The insulin, its main purpose is to bring amino acids into the tissue, like the muscle tissue. So it will cause particularly branched-chained amino acids to go into the muscle tissue. Now tryptophan, which is also in the blood, by the way, tryptophan is the precursor of serotonin, now has less competitors. The branched-chain amino acids are out of the picture for the most part. It can then cross into the brain by going across the blood-brain barrier, which is there to keep junk out from damaging our brain. The tryptophan goes into the brain and it's converted into serotonin, and a person suddenly feels more relaxed, they feel satiated. But it's a cycle, it's only temporary. And the way to get rid of those cravings is the way to get rid of the food, which is causing the inflammatory process in the gut. When you do that, the cravings go away automatically.
I see.
Would you add anything to that about cravings and brain chemistry?
Yeah, what you said is observed quite a bit in clinical practice, and once again it illustrates the importance of the health of the gastrointestinal tract and the gastrointestinal environment in trying to avoid cravings, food intolerances, and food allergies. But another aspect of craving and allergy is that an allergic response is a stressor to the body. I kind of compared just before that when we react to a protein in food, which we would call a food allergy, it's very similar in the immune system, or from the immune system's perspective, as if the immune system was reacting to a protein in a bacteria or a virus. So of course we think of an infection as a stressor to the body. Well, so is an allergy or an intolerance. And stressors create stress hormones. And these stress hormones invoke what we call the fight or flight system. It mobilizes the body to get ready to fight, kick, scream, run, do something. But it causes increased blood sugar, it causes other types of hormones which make us feel more vital and more able to get up and go. It gives us a feeling of power, if you will. Similar to caffeine, for instance. When people get up in the morning, they go to Starbucks or their favorite coffee shop and get, a coffee loaded with caffeine, they feel invigorated. They can face the day. Well, it's because it's invoking these same exact hormones. Now, just as you become, let's say, addicted, or you get cravings for your coffee in the morning and that jolt of caffeine, food intolerances and food allergies can actually act in a similar mechanism and make you crave the very things that cause the allergy or the intolerance.
So if a person has a food intolerance to a particular food item, does it mean that they can never eat that food again?
No, not necessarily. It really depends on the type of reaction, the type of allergy or intolerance. There are some food allergies which are very severe, and they tend to be determined by our genes or our genetics. And classic examples would be people who eat, let's say, strawberries, shrimp, peanuts, and we've all heard the story, their lips swell up and they can't breathe and they may have to be hospitalized. Those are severe allergies, or what we call anaphylactic allergies. They're usually very, very quick. They happen as soon as you consume the food. And in many instances, those foods do have to be avoided pretty much forever. However, the vast majority of food intolerances or allergies are not that type of allergy at all, or that type of intolerance at all. They're more subtle. They can be delayed up to 72 hours or more, which means you may eat a food for breakfast and not have a negative reaction, such as a headache, fatigue, whatever it may be, until the next day. And you've eaten too much in between to ever make that firm connection. It's not like the immediate allergy where they eat a strawberry and they can't breathe. I mean, they don't need a test to determine that. The patient figures that out on their own. But these delayed sensitivities are very, very hard for the person to figure out. So that's where a test like ALCAT can really be beneficial. And with those delayed allergies, we invoke some strategies to try to make the person's immune system be able to tolerate that food again in the long run. We may have them avoid foods for 3 months or even up to 6 months, depending on how severe the category of reaction was. In the meantime, we're trying to improve their digestion and their digestive health and lower inflammation and do some other things to really help balance out their immune responses. And then over time, we slowly work some of their foods that may have been reactive on the test back into the diet while we monitor them for any return of symptoms, and we try to safely and gradually get a lot of those foods back into the diet, and generally we're very successful in doing that.
That's great. Now, how common is a food intolerance?
Food intolerance is extremely common, particularly when you get into these more subtle, delayed type of reactions that I spoke of earlier. Once again, we can't just think of those severe allergies like peanuts and strawberries. Those are the most dramatic ones, and those get the headlines. But most of us are dealing with some level of intolerance to the foods we eat. Like I said, because we eat the same foods all the time, we're overexposed to certain proteins. The modern American and Western lifestyle is not great for the intestinal system. So we generally don't have great intestinal health. We have what's called leaky gut. We may not have enough enzymes and hydrochloric acid. So we're not preparing our foods well, and we're eating the same foods over and over again. And it's really as a recipe for intolerance and sensitivity for our immune systems.
I would just add to that, too, that one of the other problems, as Dr. Brady points out, is that we don't have the enzymes to deal with all the foods that are in our diet. And our diet has changed since in industrial times in a number of different ways. Number one, the food is not grown in as natural a way as it used to be. And so there may be, on the one hand, fewer nutrients in it, nutrients that we need in order to process the food. B, additives that the immune system doesn't recognize or the immune system reacts against. And C, we're also, because of the way foods are grown commercially and the way they're shipped around, we're eating foods that our ancestors did not have an exposure to, and therefore never evolved the enzymes to break them down, to digest them, and also at later stages in the processing event, actually detoxify some chemicals that may exist naturally in the foods or have been added to the foods. And when you go through that process of not detoxifying and not fully digesting, you get to the stage where it's now in the blood, and the immune system looks at it and goes, "What's this?" Mm-hmm. and perceives it as a threat. As Dr. Brady said, a bacteria or a virus, and mobilizes its resources to fight against it, to neutralize it. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so common, because our habits today in modern society.
Uh-huh.
Roger makes a great point. Our diet today is very different than our ancestors. There's a lot of work into what's called the Paleolithic diet, comparing the diet of humans for the vast majority of time, 98% or more of the time we've been on the planet. We ate the same kind of foods. We were hunter-gatherers. We ate some meat, we ate some nuts and berries and fruits and things like that. But what we did not eat is a large amount of mass-grown grains, such as, wheat, oats, rye, barley. These are all things that are staples of our modern diet, and there's many good aspects about that. It's helped feed the world and stop a lot of hunger, but it's not always perfectly adapted to our immune system. The advent of these, modern farmed grains is a very recent introduction into the human diet stream when you look at the total amount of time we've been around. And it's really not been long enough for humans to adequately adapt our enzymes and our metabolism to deal with these things. We see a lot of diseases that are tied exactly to intolerance or sensitivity to grains such as wheat and barley and rye. Celiac disease, a small intestine inflammatory disorder, which is now also being tied to potential early dementia and other types of autoimmune diseases, is a reaction to gluten and gliadin. These are parts of those very grains. Mm-hmm. Dairy, for instance, is a pretty modern introduction into the human diet stream. Even though we think they've been around for a long time, in the grand scheme of things, they really haven't.
So now I have a question for you, Roger. How accurate is this ALCAT test? I know there are other tests on the market.
Sure. Well, the accuracy of the ALCAT test is actually pretty high. The research on the ALCAT test began in 1984, and it's never stopped. We continually improving the assay. We build the analyzer that analyzes the blood cells when they're exposed to the foods or other substances to do exactly what we want, to give us a reading on the measurement of the reaction of the immune system cells. We have figured out the right chemistry to use in the test, the right sort of buffers and so forth, the right timing, the right periods of incubation, the type of antigens or food extracts that we use in the process. When you compare, so we've done all that work. When you try to assess, if you're a university professor, for example, you're an academician, and you want to assess the accuracy of an in vitro test, such as a food intolerance test, such as the ALCAT test, you have to compare it to something. So what is the one thing we know is the standard? In this case, in the area of food intolerance testing, the standard, or considered the gold standard, is an oral challenge, ideally double-blinded, which means that a person actually eats the food, and ideally under conditions where they don't know whether the food that they're eating has been indicated by the test to be reactive or non-reactive. And even the scientist, the experimenter, who's informing them which food to eat and when, they don't know. So that there could be no sort of subtle communication as to whether or not a food is reactive or not. Now, when these studies have been carried out with the ALCAT test, the correlation between the ALCAT results and a double-blinded oral challenge with food has been actually 83.4%, which is quite high. With food additives, it's been shown to be 96%. So it's not 100%. but it's fairly close. Now, compared with any other test that's been studied in this rigorous kind of way, it's way on top. So we're not 100%, but we do catch 80, let's say 85 to 90% of the things that a person has a problem with if we test for it. Now, of course, if we don't test for it, we don't know. So this is why we encourage people to have actually larger tests, and the price of the test is actually lower when the number of items tested is increased. Because our costs are down, we want to encourage people to do that. It's better. So I think that we have a great deal of confidence in the accuracy. We, as a laboratory, we're inspected by the U.S. government. As a manufacturer of the device that's used in the test, we're inspected by the FDA. So we have a lot of level of high standards that we have to follow, and we're very happy to follow them. We enjoy it. We would do it if we didn't have to, because we want to produce the best quality that we can, because we know we're dealing with people's health. And that's something we take very seriously. That's our purpose for doing this.
So Roger, how do these hidden food allergies, how do they make you fat?
Since I wrote the book, Your Hidden Food Allergies are Making You Fat, I've been asked that question before. So there's actually a number of different ways. I mentioned insulin before. I think I may have mentioned that the main purpose of insulin is to get the amino acids into the tissue. Well, that certainly is a main function of insulin, but the major function of insulin is to get sugar that comes from the digestive food that comes into the blood, into the cells where it can be used for energy. Now, unfortunately, what happens when we have an inflammatory process going on? And now, it doesn't matter what starts that inflammatory process, but since we're seeing chronic inflammation all over the place, it is, I think, reasonable to say that it's a lot of the immune system reactivity to the foods, for all the reasons that we mentioned before, that causes this inflammation. Well, we produce chemicals. The inflammatory cells produce chemicals to talk to other cells, to try and neutralize the foreign invader, and so forth. And one of them in particular, actually there's a couple of them, they have technical names. One's called tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF-alpha. Another one is an interleukin, interleukin 6. One of the purposes of these chemicals is to help the immune system defend itself from foreign invaders. One of the side effects, which is negative, is that it actually blocks insulin receptors. And this means that the sugar or glucose that's in the blood cannot get inside the cells to be used for energy. So it gets stored in the adipose tissue. It stays in the blood as triglycerides and gets stored into our fat cells. So the inflammatory process induced by our immune system reaction to the foods in the environment and other environmental chemicals is having a lot of negative effects, one of which is to prevent us from getting that sugar into the cells where it can be used as energy and it gets stored as fat. Then we feel fatigued. And then there's many other things. Also in terms of weight loss, we have the serotonin phenomenon going on. So here we have a double whammy. We have the serotonin deficit that we talked about, causing us to crave more sugar. Now we have the inflammation going on, which causes us to not be able to utilize the sugar and it gets stored as fat. So we have a negative cycle going on. So we have to break that cycle. We have to normalize the immune response so that we don't have the cravings and that the sugar and the whole of our metabolic machinery begins to function properly. So we have a normal weight and we have normal level of energy.
Roger makes a great point. He talks about a lot of the technical underpinnings of it, but reality is the modern medical literature is clearly stating that our obesity epidemic, our epidemic of metabolic syndrome, pre-diabetes, diabetes, and even cardiovascular disease is in fact an inflammatory phenomenon. That there's a common soil from which all these diseases or disorders spring from, and that is a chronic inflammatory condition in the body. Now, there are many things that can cause an inflammatory response, but certainly immune reactions, negative immune reactions over time to foods that we eat that do not agree with our individual biochemistry or our individual tolerance can certainly contribute to that inflammatory process. So inflammation and obesity go hand in hand. And then the sabotage of insulin at the target organs and a lot of other complex stuff is sort of a domino effect that spills out of that. And science is really working hard to understand this and to try to come up with viable treatment and therapeutic options. But we do know that the heavier you are, the more inflammatory you are. The more inflammatory you are, the heavier you get. So it's like a snowball running downhill.
A vicious cycle.
Yeah. Oh, so the old adage is right. You are what you eat.
Actually, you are not what you eat. You are what you eat. You are what you digest and assimilate.
Okay.
Because you can eat things and not digest them well and not absorb them. So.
The ancient Greek doctors said, they said one man's food is another man's poison. So it is, as Dr. Verdi says, it's not necessarily what you eat, although that's the starting point. It's what happens afterwards. It's how your body reacts to it. So for you, it may be poison. For another man, it's nourishment.
So when you get this test result back, and it divides the intolerances, the food intolerances, up into different categories. What are these categories? How does that work?
Well, we actually derive the categories by applying statistics to the results we see in the test tube and the apparatus, which is reported out on a computer. Now, the red foods show a much stronger reaction. So it's very likely that these are the most likely ones that are causing the physical symptoms. So they have to absolutely be avoided. Whether they can be consumed later on in moderation, we can only tell after maybe 3 or 6 months of elimination, and then either trying to phase them back into the diet on some rotational basis and some not so frequent basis. We don't have them every day. We don't want to have everything every day. Or we can retest, or combination. We have to play with this a little bit. We have to understand that the body is a dynamic situation. There's a lot of factors that influence our general health, and our general health influences how well we digest food, how well our detoxification pathways are functioning, and also how much total load we have to deal with. So for example, it's very interesting that some of the molecules in an apple, for example, will what they call cross-react. They're structurally similar to the molecules that are in birch pollen. So it might be that when the birch trees are pollinating, you can't have apples. The rest of the year you can. It's because there's too much of it. You can tolerate a certain amount, but too much is no good. And this is the thing you'll see also. We provide a rotation diet guide. Now this is a guide. It doesn't have to be adhered to absolutely, strictly 100%. It's just a guide. The underlying concept is what's important to understand, is that we don't want to rely on one small number of foods to comprise our entire diet. We want to vary our diet a lot, because each food has certain chemicals in it, proteins, fats, and actual chemicals that are not necessarily proteins or fats, but can tweak the immune system. Activate the immune system. And we can tolerate a certain amount, but too much is no good. So if we eat the same thing every day, it's very likely we're going to start developing an intolerance because we overwhelm our detoxification pathways.
Okay, so with the rotation diet, you don't necessarily have to follow it strictly.
The rotation diet guide, which we say on the screen, will show you a category of fruits, vegetables, meats, fish, dairy products, grains, and so forth. And from these categories, it will have one in one day, a different one on the next day, and so on for 4 days. So you can use that as a guide just to see that you're not having the same grain every day, if presuming grains are fine for you. You're not having the same meats every day. You're not having the same vegetables every day. Not the same nuts every day, but to have some variety so that you can learn to tolerate, and also have a diversification so that you get more of the nutrients that you require.
And this is to clarify, the rotation diet is actually rotating the foods that came out safe for you, because you don't want to develop new allergies. So the rotation diet is not used to determine which foods you are allergic to. It's used to avoid you becoming allergic to the foods that are right now okay for your immune system. And as you eliminate, we're going to eliminate the foods for a certain amount of time that you were reactive to. The remaining foods, which are your, let's say, safe foods, we're going to rotate so you don't overconsume them. And then as we try to reintroduce foods that you may have reacted to initially, after we take them out for a while, after we help the digestive system, then we'll put those foods into the rotation. In other words, you don't eat those foods every day. Again, you're going to eat them, occasionally, and give your immune system a break, basically, from confronting that same protein or that same chemical in the food on an ongoing basis.
Are there supplements that you can take during this elimination phase?
There are, and they really are supplements that help some of the things I already talked about. For instance, in some cases, we'll recommend digestive enzymes, which are normally made by your pancreas, but additional enzymes, particularly to digest proteins, can be helpful in lowering your potential to react to a food. If someone is low in hydrochloric acid in the stomach, we may use some hydrochloric acid supplementation. There are some things that are very important for the integrity of the intestinal lining to keep proteins and other things out of the bloodstream until the body has prepared them. Things like L-glutamine. There are some herbs or botanicals that are commonly used, for instance, to help inflamed or even ulcerated intestinal linings. We could use in this application as well. Things like licorice root, slippery elm, marshmallow root, chamomile. A lot of people sip chamomile tea when they have an upset stomach.
So when I get these test results back, can I contact ALCAT?
800 US ALCAT. We have staff who can answer questions. We have staff who can provide directions to who in your local area you can contact for ongoing guidance and support.
Very good. Okay, I'd like to hear about some testimonials. Tell me some case studies.
Well, I do a myriad or a large array of different types of very cutting-edge metabolic and nutritional testing. And the ALCAT test is one of the most common tests that I do. It's certainly not the only one, but it is one of them. And it's really been the key to unlocking mysteries in some very difficult cases, including situations where we know food sensitivity, food intolerance, food allergy may indeed be playing a role. And they're very diverse. Everything from vague gastrointestinal symptoms, bloating after meals, gas, people with irritable bowel syndrome, to those with respiratory conditions, reactive airway disease and asthma, skin conditions, rashes that no one can figure out, headache, fatigue. There's been many situations where we've tried a lot of different things, a lot of different dietary strategies. We looked at thyroid diseases and things like that in conditions and ruled them all out, and someone could still not lose any weight. And at the end of the rope, in the beginning, before we figured out this strong connection, we would ALCAT test them or food intolerance and sensitivity test them, get them off the foods their immune system didn't agree with, and all of a sudden, if they then followed, a decent dietary regime and some of the other supplementation things we do, they were able to lose weight. So it seemed to be able to provide a little bit of a shift in metabolism when someone got on a diet that was compatible with their unique biochemistry. So it's really, food allergy and food intolerance can cause a whole range of symptoms and signs around the body. And it's a very diverse mix. And it never ceases to amaze me. I've had people come in. I had one woman come in who she was in her late 30s. And I remember the day she came in. It was several years ago, but my medical assistant came out of the room from doing her vital signs and, doing some of the initial things and said, "You're not going to believe, this woman's rash. She has such a bad rash on her face, back, and arms that she even has cracks on her face that are oozing and bleeding." And when I went and met with the woman, the minute I looked at her, my interpretation, just through my experience, is she was having a very bad allergic, what we call an atopic allergic type of reaction, or she was very toxic or something was going on. And when I did her history, I found out that she had been to an Ivy League medical teaching hospital and had seen multiple dermatologists, multiple allergists. She actually was the topic of a grand rounds presentation between the allergy and dermatology department at an Ivy League medical school. And she was put on oral and topical corticosteroids and other types of things that, are tried with allergies and skin disorders, and she didn't have any luck. Finally, she found out about our sort of integrative practice that looked sort of at things a little bit differently at times. And one of the things we did with her was an ALCAT test and found out that she was very sensitive to dairy and somewhat sensitive to corn. And when that came back, she was really astonished because she had been tested, according to her, for allergies. But they did more conventional testing. Many people have maybe had the needles pricked under their skin to look if there's a reaction, which really works well in these immediate allergies I was talking about earlier. especially for airborne allergies, dust and dander and mold and things like that. For a lot of the delayed pathway food allergies, it doesn't work at all. So we tested her in a different way and found out she was allergic. And when we eliminated those things from the diet, she had a dramatic turnaround. Not only her skin condition, but she had chronic colds and flus. She had low energy and low vitality, and chronic yeast infections because her immune system was so under siege from the allergies it couldn't really deal with some of the other things. She also had mild asthma as well. And so on the steroids, that also created yeast infections, and she was really a mess. And within a very short amount of time, I think 4 to 6 weeks, her rashes were about 50% gone. And within